sure you don't want to move closer, everybody? Okay. All right. So let's see, is the video going? All right, well then, let me welcome and I'll get us going. So good afternoon and thanks for coming. For some in the room who might not know who I am, my name is Jeff Spalding and I'm the very new Chancellor for the Vermont State College System and very excited about joining the team and the family. And you know, we are off and running. We're here this week at Johnson with several members of the board and a very involved search committee trying to help winnow the field so that we can have a super new leader for Johnson State College. And I've been so impressed with the candidates that I've had the chance to meet so far and really appreciate the hard work of the folks that have put together an amazing agenda and a logistical feat to actually have the candidates go through their processes here. So it's really been fun to be here. We thought, since there were several trustees that were involved with the search committee, and since we have a very important decision to make at the board level next month, and that relates to setting tuition for the coming school year, or perhaps for the next 2 years, this might be a possibility as well, that we ought to use the opportunity of being here to have an educational session on the issue of tuition. How tuition relates to recruitment, how it relates to retention, what is our responsibility as a board as it relates to affordability, how does tuition intersect with scholarship, what are the timing issues, are there some innovative approaches that others are using that we ought to consider, whether it's charging by the credit or guaranteeing a tuition level for the 4 years, or let's say for a period of years, 4 years. There are many permutations that are out there. And we thought that as we lead up to the Finance Committee, which Elaine, I believe, is on the 11th of February, and then the board meeting the following week, having a chance for the board to engage in a discussion of the issue of tuition would be a useful endeavor. So that's what we're up to today. There are no decisions, if you're wondering, folks in the audience, being made today at all. This is an educational session. Although my hope, is that President Barbara Murphy? Yeah. All right. Just back from San Francisco via New York. San Francisco to New York wasn't too bad, right?
No, and it was LA actually, but that much snow, Vermont would have been humming full tilt.
All right, well, we're glad to have you back.
Thank you.
And yeah, so no decisions being made today, but perhaps at the end with trustees, we might do some brainstorming on some of the alternatives for motions or resolutions, if we call them that may come out of a finance committee to the board. Things like, well, 1 year versus 2 year level versus increase, and some of those other permutations that I mentioned that could be possible. And then just so that we have them in our mind, we can think about them a little bit. And then on the 11th, the Finance Committee will be getting hot and heavy with some specifics and scenarios and what-ifs. And hopefully this session will be getting people's minds in gear and giving us the chance to have a thoughtful dialogue on the subject. So we have a great panel this afternoon. This is going to be the first portion of the program. Each one of the panelists will have 5 to 10 minutes to share their perspectives on the related issues to tuition. We have a panel that we will introduce, but that comes from a variety of experiences, responsibilities, and perspectives on the issue. And then we'll have a chance to engage in dialogue with the trustees in questions and answers, and we would invite the presidents in the audience that when we get to the questions and answers, if they feel like maybe they can contribute in that would be wonderful as well. After we have that dialogue, we'll take a break. Then we'll come back and our Vice President and CFO, Tom Robbins, wherever he went out there in the audience somewhere, right up there, has some sort of high-level data for us to look at. Not the kind of like granular and what-if kind of, if we did this, that we'll do at the Finance Committee, but more like okay, what have we done recently in the past? What are some other states doing? How have things changed over the years? And just sort of get our mind around that. We'd then have a little further discussion, and then we would love to have a chance if there are members that are not trustees that are here that would like to, at that point, say, well, here's what I think, or have some input in some fashion. That would be very welcome. And then, as I mentioned, we might do a little brainstorming on potential motions to come forth. So a couple of logistical items to mention, and then we'll do an introduction to the board, and then we'll get to the panel. So logistically, we are recording this, and so panelists, you really should speak into the microphone, even if you're one of those like me that says, I can speak to the whole audience without a microphone. And we're recording it, and we need you to use the microphone. 2, for members, trustees, or others that are particularly in the front, if you want to use the restroom and don't want to walk up the stairs and go that way, apparently you can go out this door here, right over here, and get to restrooms. So you should know that as well. And if there are other logistical items, I can't remember what they are. So with that, we'll get ourselves started. And I'll introduce the panel, and then I thought I'd mention actually, I'll introduce the panel by suggesting an order that we go in. And there's no particular rhyme or reason to this order other than I really didn't want it to be predictable. So that's about it. So Maurice, you're on the hot spot in the first place. And Maurice, we met, is the enrollment director, and he's got a more formal, with another word or two, title in it at Castleton State College. I think it's Director of Enrollment Management Services, or something like that, but right along those lines. And Maurice is going to go first. And then Alyssa Slayman is a Johnson College student, and she is a very valued member of the Board of Trustees for the Vermont State Colleges. Is also participating in the search committee. And Alyssa, we are looking forward to having you go second, if that's okay. Then we're going to go to President Joe B, not President Joe M. Joe Bertolino, the president of Linden State College, will go next. And not everybody probably knows it, but Joe has had, prior to coming to Linden State College, a lot of experience in the enrollment management area himself, among other credentials that he has. This is an area that he's spent some time on. So we're glad to have you with us, Joe. And then sitting next to you is somebody that I've enjoyed working with for many years with a different hat on, who has been involved with financial aid, enrollment management for Community College of Vermont for a long time. We served together on the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation Board, and I know she's one of the real academic and financial aid heavyweights in the state of Vermont. Not that she's been around that long, she's earned it all by, like, I didn't mean that part, all right. Pam Chisholm, and that's great. Then we have our newest president of the Vermont State Colleges, down at Vermont Tech, Dan Smith, President Dan, who also is a graduate of the Chancellor's Office and was the Director of External Affairs and Public Policy, or Governmental Affairs and Policy, something along those lines, and is doing a great job down at Vermont Tech. And we are really proud of the alumni from the Chancellor's Office, and our batting cleanup will be alumnus of the Chancellor's Office, and that's President Joe Moore, who for the last 7 years has been president of Lesley University in Cambridge, Mass. For some of us, like Gary Moore, who, like me, has been around for a while, and probably Dave Walk too, we will remember when Joe was the Director of Academic Affairs and Planning in the Chancellor's Office, and was also one of those heavyweights out there. And we're very proud of the fact that after he left the Chancellor's Office, he became the Provost and Academic Affairs Officer at Mansfield University in Pennsylvania, was then the President of Empire State College in New York, and as I mentioned, has now been at Lesley University. And it was kind of nice of Joe to make the drive up here this morning and make it. And we're looking forward to hearing his perspectives on the issue, which I think you will enjoy. And hopefully, trustees, it'll sort of, all of these presentations together will kind of like motivate you to ask questions and make comments. And we all should feel free to not feel like we're asking anything that, like, we're, stupid or ignorant or anything along those lines, and there is no such thing. This is an educational session, and we're, really looking forward to the dialogue, at least I am. So before we turn it over to Maurice, I thought it would be a good idea for the trustees, if you wouldn't mind, for the panel and is one thing, but the audience as a whole to know who are the trustees that are here, if you wouldn't mind standing up and telling us. And Chairman O'Connor, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, then we'll just sort of have people go one at a time and introduce themselves.
Yes, Martha O'Connor, Chair of the Board from Brattleboro, Vermont. And Bill?
Representative Bill Lippert from Heinsberg, Vermont, Legislative Trustee.
Gary?
Gary Moore, soon to go off the board, Bradford.
Jerry?
Jerry Diamond, Montpelier, not soon to go off.
Lynn?
Lynn Dickinson, I'm a representative from St. Albans Town, and I'm a legislative trustee.
Hi, Tim German. I'm a legislative trustee from Essex Junction.
Jim Maslin, legislative trustee, Thetford, and some other small towns.
Craig Hannum, trustee from Dorset.
And Craig, thanks for making the drive up from Dorset too. And I don't know if they're on the phone yet, but we do have a couple of trustees that are going to be calling in. It is my understanding that Linda Milne is on the phone now. I guess we could.
Although I will leave shortly and then come back later.
Okay, well, Linda, thank you for making the time. And as you know, we are recording it as well, so you can take advantage of both of those opportunities. And Chris McFarland, who is the chair of our Finance Committee, is expected to call in a little later this afternoon as well. And, people sometimes wonder whether legislative trustees are committed or not. The fact that all of our legislative trustees were able to make it here when the legislature is in session, I think should end any thoughts along those lines. We appreciate your willingness to take the time to come out of the legislature and engage with us in this important discussion. So, I don't know that I've forgotten anything, so I think we'll get ourselves started. And our first panelist, and let's see, one thing I did think of, Elaine, do you have a watch on? Okay, so we should actually keep track of these gentlemen, just to make sure they don't go on for 20 minutes. Thought we'd give Joe a little special dispensation for making the drive and bad and cleanup. But for the rest of us, listen, if you want to do it in 5 minutes, that's fine. But really, no more than 10 would be really helpful. So with that, okay. Maurice Ouimet. Thank you, Maurice.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I want to thank Jeb, I want to thank Dave, and all members of the board for inviting me here today. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to have a discussion around a topic that's very important to me in the work that I do at Castleton. I've been at Castleton since 2002, just starting my 13th year. And it's very, very challenging out there when we talk about recruiting students, not just at Castleton, but all of our colleges. I speak on behalf of all my colleagues. It's getting more and more challenging every year. This past year was by far the most challenging in my tenure at Castleton. It's not because people don't want to come or they're interested, they love it. It comes down to other reasons, primarily related to scholarships, which I hope to tie into the tuition topic here today. But I wanted to start, and please, I'm glad Jeb mentioned the time limit because I'm an admissions person, I could talk for hours. So please just give me the hook when you're ready, and we can touch on some of these other topics later. But I wanted to give everyone a quick overview of the recruitment cycle. Right now, we're recruiting students to start at Castleton in the fall of 2016. The high school juniors are receiving information from us, they're attending college fairs, they're requesting information, they're visiting campus, and one of the first questions that most typically their parents will ask is, what does it cost? And we're able to have tuition figures for the current year that we're in, but that's not going to be affecting them.
So Maurice, one of my, the great things about being the moderator is I can just kick in. I just want to make sure, did you say 15 or 16?
I said 16, fall of 2016.
Okay, so not this fall, the next fall. Already.
Correct. Yeah. So in admissions, we balance recruiting for 2 different classes at once. So we are in the thick of recruiting for the fall of 2015, but we're already starting for fall of 2016 as well. And people want to know what the costs are. There are a number of tools that students can utilize out there today. By law, all colleges are obligated to have a net price calculator on their website. And that's a tool that's very popular for students and their families to use when they start the college search process. And when tuition figures aren't current, if scholarship programs aren't current, it really puts us at a disadvantage. And oftentimes students will just leave that based on the information they see, and we'll never hear from them or see them again. So it's a very powerful tool. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, in the last year, over 1,100 students or their families have utilized the net price calculator at Castleton. Another thing to consider today is how students and parents are being coached. Everyone wants a scholarship. It doesn't matter what our sticker price is, everybody wants a scholarship. It's not just based on need, it's not just based on merit, it could be a potential for success scholarship, everybody wants one. And they're being coached to ask for them. So when we send out initial financial aid awards, students are oftentimes, they look at them, their parents look at them, and then the phone rings. And they'll say, I know you can do better than this. And I hate to make the connection to buying a car, but in a lot of ways it is that way today, and it's not good. But that's the reality of what we're dealing with on a daily basis. Parents want to make a deal, and it makes it very challenging in the end. And oftentimes we'll get calls, and one school is pinned against another. I've received calls from students that have been admitted at Johnson and received a scholarship, and then they turn around and say, well, how come you're not giving it to me at Castleton? And they pin one of us against another, and that's unfortunate. But the importance of yield is where this all goes. As I mentioned earlier, this past year was a very challenging year for us, and it was because of yield. It's not because of interest. The tuition and scholarship package go hand in hand. And I would really advocate for the board to consider a 2-year setting of tuition. And I tell you why. It was done a few years ago, and I have some evidence that would suggest that it was the right thing to do and it was successful. It was for the year 2012, 2013, and 2013-2014. We had our tuition set. We've seen our yield steadily declining, and this is a trend at a lot of places, not just Castleton. Our yield of admitted students who choose to enroll has been declining. So we need to admit more students every year to meet our enrollment goals. But during the 2012-13 year, our yield was X. The following year, it remained the same. So the fact that we were able to promote what tuition was going to be 2 years out really helped our ability to yield those students. And furthermore, it helped our current students, because in the fall of 2013, we had our highest retention rate in my time at Castleton, and I think it's an all-time high as far as the record books go back. So those students who enrolled in the fall of 2012 knew what their tuition was going to be in the fall of 2013, and we were able to retain more of them. They were able to plan. So I think that's some pretty powerful data. I wish we could study it over time, but that's the only 2-year period that we've done that in the past. So I think that's all I wanted to say for right now. But as far as scholarships go, I wanted to get this out there. I think that I would recommend a modest increase in Vermont resident tuition every year if it means we can continue to invest in the scholarship programs. Because again, it's not so much about what the sticker price is, it's about what the student is going to get. And it enables us to go out and target the populations that we know will be successful. And this doesn't just go at Castleton, it goes everywhere. We want to attract students who are going to be successful. So using merit and need-based scholarships, some critics would say that merit scholarships are elitist, and I would say no for what we're doing. We're targeting B students with average SAT scores, and we're awarding that money to those students who are hardworking Vermonters and students from out of state. And we know they're going to be successful and graduate.
Maurice, thank you very much. And that was a lot of good stuff in a nice, concise fashion as well, so thank you. Alyssa Slayman, you're next.
So I'm speaking about tuition from the student perspective. So I guess when thinking about tuition, when you first ask a student, what do you think about tuition? The only thing they say is, you can do anything but don't raise it. But I guess when you're really looking at the numbers, it's a lot less than people actually think it's going to be. Looking at like a modest tuition increase is probably about the price someone would spend on like a science textbook, and people are a little bit more okay with that. But I know that a lot of people would rather see a tuition increase than having their quality of their education compromised, which a lot of things that happens when like academic services are cut and when faculty and staff are laid off. A lot of students I know at Johnson were a little surprised that we had a tuition increase last year, and then also we saw staff and faculty or staff laid off. So I think that's a little bit of a transparency issue. I think a lot of students would be more okay with tuition increase if they actually knew where their money was going. They'd really like to see the breakdown and not really be surprised at the end of the year when there's a layoff and when we also had tuition increases. But I know there is some students out there that when there is a tuition increase, then that may be the make or break point of them coming to college, but they would have to be looking at places to compromise because everywhere in the nation there is tuition going up, and we all know with like low state appropriations, we're probably going to see some sort of raise in tuition. But I guess that just comes like with a little bit more education from the institutions. Some students don't really know where they can find scholarships and find that aid that they would need if the tuition did go up. So I guess it comes a little bit more transparency and education if we were to raise tuition. But I know for a lot of students, they would rather pay a little bit more to save some jobs. And then, a little bit. I know I talked to a few students about what they thought about tuition, and I know a lot of students this year, they're angry because a lot of the classes that they need aren't offered. And so I think we could raise tuition at a modest amount so that we could keep some more faculty here so that we wouldn't be running into those issues that possibly could hurt our retention rates in the future. But that's all I really basically had to say, is that I think students would be a little bit more open to the fact of raising tuition if we could really, they would feel like they're paying and they're getting like a really good quality education out of it. Because if they don't feel like they're getting what they're paying for, then they're going to be looking elsewhere for places to go. So yeah, that's all I really had to say.
You said a lot, Alyssa.
Yeah.
You said it in the right amount of time. And thank you. We'll look forward to your participation in the dialogue afterwards as well. So President Joe Bertolino from Linden State College.
I'm going to take more time.
Yes, sir.
I'm just letting you know. Do I have permission to do that?
Well, if somebody yielded their time to you.
Hi, how you doing? I will, anyway. I'm Joe Bertolino, president of Linden State, and I'm in my third year there, and I do have a lot to share. You know, the topic of the panel is tuition, and I'd like to take the time allotted to me to talk about tuition in the context of the larger ecosystem of our colleges. Enrollment, competition, affordability, expense management, and success strategies. I think it's the intersection of the environmental drivers such as enrollment, the impact of prices on our students, and in the management of academic and other expenses, that tuition rates become a pivotal decision for us. Let's start with enrollment for a minute. We've seen a decline in enrollment at Linden State, and we're not alone. We're not alone in the Vermont State College system, in the state of Vermont, in the Northeast, or in the nation. Save for the West and sections of the South, we have declining numbers of traditional college-age students nationally. Far more colleges than not are facing enrollment challenges. For most of our Vermont colleges, the problem is exacerbated by further decline in rural populations. Urban colleges are growing, or flat, but for the most part they are growing, while most of the reduction is occurring at rural institutions. Recently, I was invited to a meeting of college presidents for the American Association of State Colleges and Universities in DC, and 40 college presidents gathered together to discuss declining enrollment and our responses to that. And I'll discuss a little bit more about that in a few moments. But I say this because I want to reiterate that we are not alone. This is not a Vermont problem. This is not a Vermont State College problem. It's far more broader. It's important to understand that this is a common experience for two reasons. First, so that we don't look for isolated factors affecting the Vermont State College system, because quite frankly, that would be a waste of time and be a waste of effort. And second, so that our planning takes into account the fact that nationally, colleges and universities are trying to do what we are trying to do. Innovate program delivery, find new efficiencies, expand revenue streams, and cut costs. With everyone moving to the top of their game, we at the VSC must do it even better. Setting tuition rates is one of the most important decisions that a board makes each year. In that context, I think it's important to recognize that we, the colleges, and you, our trustees, have a shared goal to provide an excellent education experience for Vermont students and support the economy and civic life of the communities in which we are, to provide an excellent educational experience for all of our students. And this is an important concept. We are Vermont state institutions, but as colleges, we serve students from across our region and even across the country. This is important because each of the VSC colleges serves a slightly different population. The Linden demographic is different from CCV, from Castleton, etc. And even within the Vermont student population, there are important subgroups found in different measure on different campuses. For example, veterans, first in family, etc. Why is this important? Because we need, at both the board and campus level, a deep understanding of the entire array of students and how best to engage them in learning and living communities. Our expense and revenue decisions are driven by that understanding. Let me be more blunt. And perhaps Joe is taking a risk here in saying this. Yes, we are in some measure tax funded. And yes, we serve taxpayers. But all colleges serve taxpayers of one form or another. And I would put forward the idea that the primary fiduciary responsibility of the board is the wise creation and use of VSC resources for all the students we serve, not just Vermonters. And that's subtly but importantly different from a primary focus on Vermont students and the stewardship of funds from Vermont taxpayers. Lastly, we strive for excellence. Relevant, powerful experiential programs, accessibility, and attainability designed for student success and graduation. We find ourselves at a financial crossroads. Declining enrollment and either deficits at all 4 of our campuses and a substantial proactive reduction at our community college has led to a system-wide, what some would term a financial crisis. Our colleges here, and really throughout the higher education industry, were built on a paradigm of growth. This paradigm is no longer applicable. Let me say that again, that most higher education institutions were built on a paradigm of growth. In my opinion, this paradigm is no longer applicable. The infrastructure of program, people, services, and facilities now often exceeds enrollment. For example, at Linden, old strategic plans suggested that the campus is structured for an enrollment of between 1,600 and 1,800 students. Our enrollment is more like 1,300 to 1,400 students. Academically, while we have approximately the same number of students that we had a few years ago, we are offering far more courses than ever before, a curriculum sized for a larger student population. The chance of our being able to grow our way to balance, at least in our traditional fishing pools for students, is slim to none. That means that we need a new paradigm for structuring and funding our operations. A decision made in February to freeze tuition for the following fall will have little to no impact on recruitment. To make the most of the potential recruiting benefits of a flat tuition, we would need time to market it thoroughly. The population to which it appeals in recruiting is generally a more affluent population, and this group is generally earlier in the cycle than March. To make the most of it from a retention standpoint, we would want to start using it in our financial aid and related communications that actually start in January. Tuition is the largest source of operating revenue at each of the VSC colleges, period. We've all heard these statistics, but let me remind you that the bulk of our income comes from tuition. Very little from the state appropriation. A flat tuition, in order to be viable against rising cost, presumes either funding from another source and/or major cost reductions and/or increased volumes. However, we don't expect increased funding from the state. We are already reeling from last fall's decline in enrollment, a decline that has been system-wide, though at significantly different times. To some extent, as a system, we've planned for it. But in the aggregate, we have underlying deficits funded when they are funded by one-time sources of funds. This is an important point. We are currently meeting our deficits by using one-time funds. This is not sustainable, and flat tuition will only exacerbate the problem. The demographics of Vermont, and indeed most of the Northeast, do not support a growth model for enrollment. If the board were to choose a flat tuition rate, my recommendation would be to consider a modest increase for the coming year and a flat rate for the following, a 2-year plan. The other side of the tuition growth is the financial impact on students and their families. The VSC is not immune from the crisis of access and affordability that is pandemic across higher education. Almost all Linden students participate in one or more financial aid program while at college. Last year, 84% of our students had federal grants and/or loans. 69% of them had grants and/or work study from the college. And while grants are generally for fixed amounts, loan caps do increase from freshman to sophomore year and sophomore to junior year. The amount of that cumulative increase, about $2,000, exceeds the increase in tuition, room, and board over a 4-year period. So out-of-pocket costs should be relatively stable. However, for many students, the amount of aid they receive falls short of their real need. There is a gap between what the family can afford and their out-of-pocket costs. So while the amount of the gap may be relatively stable over time, the financial weight of the gap grows. And let me give you an example. My godson Nicholas applied to Linden State College. He was accepted, and his family had an ability to pay nothing. They are low income. Even after receiving grants and loans from the government and Linden, my godson would have had a gap of more than $10,000. So in year one, when the family can afford to pay almost nothing, they would have had to pay $10,000. In year two, tuition and fees go up, but they can borrow more money, so the gap again becomes $10,000. The family has now invested $20,000 that they don't have in their child's education. You can see how that accumulates over the 4 years. Needless to say, Nicholas did not come to Linden State College. It was cheaper to stay in the state of New Jersey and go to school there. So in many ways, one could say that it isn't the tuition increase that is so painful, but rather the unrelieving gap that accumulates year over year over year. At Linden, we are doing a number of things to prepare for next year. We have been engaged in a very strategic plan to close a $3.1 million budget gap next year. This gap, we assume, comes from 3 things: stable to low enrollment, 2, no increase in tuition, and no increase in the state appropriation. What does this mean for Linden? For Linden, it will mean that we will have layoffs, we will not hire many of our current part-time faculty and cut back on overloads, we will decrease the number of courses offered, and decrease some services to students. It's not all dire. In some areas, we will capitalize on recent increases in efficiency to make the changes. We've been engaging in a 10% exercise. What would the college look like if it were 10% smaller? Does a tuition increase help? Well, it certainly will not alleviate a $3.1 million budget deficit, but it does help us in our planning and in making future decisions. And so I would kindly ask you, I will end with this. when I was in DC, all of the presidents came to the same conclusion. A strong liberal arts core plus experiential education equals success. And I sat back as they all talked about, gosh, how can we have a better experiential education experience? Because we all have the liberal arts core. And I thought of the VSC. We already have the experiential education in place. So we already have the sweet spot. I would contend that ultimately we need to be 5 interconnected colleges. And that's different from the rhetoric of 5 independent, 5 strong colleges. We need to be 5 interconnected colleges while at the same time maintaining our individual identities. Something for us to think about. I've gone way over time. Thank you.
Hey, Joe, that was great. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. It was worth the time. And Pam Chisholm, you're next. So,
Note to self, never present after Joe. I feel so pedestrian now in my remarks, but I would just like the trustees to know, as Jeff alluded to, I've been doing this work for quite a while, and I consulted with my colleagues, the other directors of financial aid within the system. We've got 150 years of financial aid experience. Don't worry, there are succession plans. That would indicate we've been doing this a while. But I'd also like to mention that back in 2003, Kathy O'Mara, who's the director at Castleton, and I did a presentation for the EPSL committee on sort of how financial aid works, kind of the nitty-gritty, how we put together packages. It was well received at the time, and I know everybody didn't get to see it. We would be happy to haul it out and dust it off and do it for you again if that would be helpful. As we talked, when a student or family walks through our door, you know, as Mo said, they ask, you know, how much is this going to cost? And then their next question is, then how am I going to do it? And every aid office in the system sits down with the student and or their families and walks them through this process to look at all the various options that they have, and using a bunch of available tools. Payment plans are available on all the campuses. Families can pay a monthly amount, 3 to 5 months, so that it's manageable that way. Third party, Department of Labor, military, veterans benefits, those sorts of things, and financial aid, of course, which are need-based grants based on the information the family provides, student loans, work study, scholarships. The eligibility for need is based on a federally established formula that calculates what a family should be able to pay at a current income and prior income. To be honest, it's kind of a rationing tool. It's moved over the years that I've been doing this from an honest evaluation, perhaps, of what a family could really afford to pay to what works within the federal dollars that are in the system that could be distributed. So I think when our families get the results and they see that, you know, their family contribution is going to be $10,000, they're stunned. And then you add to that the gap that Joe referred to, and that's when some very creative packaging has to start happening. At CCV, 70% of our students receive financial aid. A large majority of those are Pell Grant recipients, and so we're very fortunate that way. And as Mo mentioned, the net price calculator. A family goes in and puts in information, some information that's comparable to what they put on the financial aid form when they apply for aid, and it spits out what they're going to be eligible for, shows them the grant and scholarship opportunities from those schools, because we program these to model what we do at each one of our campuses, and then it shows them the difference between their total cost and the grant aid, which could be filled by loans, payment plans, those sorts of things. One of the questions that was posed to us in preparing for this was to talk about student loan debt. And there's been a lot of media hype. I'm sure you've all seen it about the students who have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Well, it's like Stormageddon in New York City this past week. That isn't all that true. Only 3.7% of all borrowers nationally have balances greater than $100,000, and that tends to be professional, medical school students, law students, those sorts of things. 40% of all borrowers have less than $10,000 in their debt when they graduate. Here in Vermont, we are right around $25,000, $26,000 for our bachelor's degree students. And to put that into perspective, if a student, let's say, borrowed even up to $30,000, with the repayment options that are available now, the repayment can be as low as $170 a month and as high as $314 a month. So it's manageable. The government is putting in lots of different ways for students to repay their student loan debt. I apologize for the glasses too. I'm envious. You put yours on and then you took them off. You're younger than me. So, where does, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, where does setting the tuition rate impact all this? Setting it sooner rather than later is so helpful from the admission standpoint, from the financial aid standpoint, for both recruitment and retention. If families know they can plan, we can help them plan. Not knowing, I think Melissa and I were talking about this earlier, I think about the admissions counselors from the 4 campus-based schools, and they're out at these fairs and they're talking to parents, and so what's your tuition going to be next year? Well, we don't exactly know yet. Wouldn't inspire a lot of confidence, would make you concerned about the stability perhaps of the institutions you're looking at. Little bait and switchy, I think. Prospective students have to make a decision fairly quickly, depending on the institutions to which they're applying, where they're going to deposit. And it's high stress for many families, and sometimes they're going to jump at the first aid offer they get. Like, oh, we can do this one's good, that's where you're going. So if we're not able to get our award letters out in a timely fashion for our prospective students, we may be losing them to the schools that have a little bit of a jump on us. When we look at CCB, and Alyssa alluded to this too, it's the cost of a science textbook at the campus-based institutions. At CCB, a 3% increase in tuition would be $7 a credit. That sounds manageable. We have ways to help our students get there. The tuition discounting conversation, the use of scholarships. We don't do this very much at CCB, but in my other world experience in financial aid, I have seen it used effectively, used it myself. It helps the institution shape the student body that they want. So they have diversity in income levels and ethnicity, athletics, academically talented, the tuba player who dots the I at Ohio State, probably on a scholarship, and out-of-state net tuition revenue. So if you offer a $5,000 award to a student, you recognize much more in your net revenue from the families paying the rest of it, and you add to the diversity on your campus. So one of the last thing I want to say about that too is that there's been some articles about teaser rates where they throw money at students for their freshman year and then it declines after that. We don't do that in the VSC. The need awarded grants may flow up and down depending on what the family's income levels are. The scholarships will remain the same as long as the students are meeting whatever requirements are attached to the scholarship, usually a GPA. So we don't do the bait and switch. So knowing what the tuition rate is going to be going forward allows families to plan. It allows us to provide good, solid information. So we appreciate your consideration of that.
Great, ma'am. This is really working out well. Getting different perspectives, and now we're going to turn to President Dan from Vermont Tech.
Thanks, Jeb. I want to thank the board and Jeb for undertaking this inquiry and this strategic discussion of tuition coming into the vote next the next board cycle. From my perspective, there's no bigger strategic question facing the colleges, and in many ways, I think Vermont Tech, where I came on about 9 months ago now, has been the canary in the coal mine for the enrollment trends across the state. We're down 180 full-time equivalent students over the last 5 years, and I don't think as Joe Berlino observed, I don't think I'm being responsible if I'm predicating our recovery on the growth of 180 and recovery of 180 students over the course of the next couple of years. The demographics in Vermont and the demographics in northern New England don't support that. So I was asked to step in to help address a projected $4 million shortfall coming into this fiscal year. We took aggressive steps early, and the board authorized us to run with a $2.4 million shortfall during this fiscal year. I want to acknowledge Tom Robbins was hugely important to us in structuring how we could reduce our expenses coming into this fiscal year. The college, I think, is heading in the right direction, and we've got some momentum. But the thing that I want the board to consider as it approaches these tuition discussions is the same thing I asked legislators to consider in my economic development pitch at the opening night of the session. Innovation requires investment. It can't occur when institutions are on their heels in terms of their financial picture. Over the last 5 years, expenses across the system, which are largely fixed, have gone up on an average of 4.4 to 4.5%. Our tuition increases have been less than that. Anytime tuition goes up and enrollment stays flat, but tuition goes up less than our projected increases in expense, we're forced into cuts, reductions, strategic adjustments that over time will begin to threaten the educational quality and the quality of the student experience at these institutions. And I share that because I think I am the canary in the coal mine. The thing that keeps me awake at night is that some revenue event is going to be necessary for me to avoid cuts that will threaten, I think, an almost irrecoverable cycle for this college. I can't predicate our recovery on enrollment increases. We may regain some, but as long as our tuition goes up less than our projected expenses, I'm going to deal with increased student concerns about the quality of the facilities they're learning in, increased student concerns about the reductions in courses we offer, and changes to the curriculum that we're delivering. I've been in front of faculty assembly, and they're doing an incredible job meeting my request and proposal that we reduce the number of credits in our programs. We may have been credit heavy. But the feedback from industry and our industry advisory groups and the feedback from faculty who are experts in their fields is that it will have a qualitative impact on our degrees. So as we work to get back into balance, my hope is that the board looks at these tuition decisions, and when you use the verbiage of a modest tuition increase, we have a very, very good and rational reason for a tuition increase that doesn't cover our projected expenses into the coming year, because further reductions will have a dramatic impact on my institution, and I won't speculate on the other presidents. I'm concerned about our trajectory in that regard. I do believe that having tuition set 2 years in succession will be helpful to families in the college in terms of marketing and planning. I'm concerned that any tuition freeze will not have the downstream impact on an enrollment increase that I think underlies the theory behind it. In which case, as Joe outlined, our revenues will only be further out of balance with our expenses, and the qualitative educational experience that Alyssa identified would be further impacted. So I apologize if I seem over dramatic, but when the board asked me to come on in this role, I promised them candor. I believe the college is headed in the right direction with the opportunity to market the incredible work that is done in our classrooms by our faculty and the experience we offer both in Randolph and in Williston and around the state. But I'm worried about our strategic trajectory if the only answer to our revenue solution is to continue to cut. And so I look forward to the give and take in the question and answer.
You're up, my friend.
Thanks, Jeff. It's delightful to be back in Vermont. I was in the Chancellor's office from the late 80s until the mid-90s and was intimately familiar with tuition rates, grant programs, state, federal, what the net costs were for Vermonters, NEVI students, and out-of-state students who came to the VSC. So I've looked over the most recent fact book, which we started when I was in the Chancellor's office, and got an update, in terms of where that is. So I'm just going to make a few comments. I'll be pretty brief, and hope that I might be helpful during the conversation and contribute some things there. When I left here, I was the provost at Mansfield University in north central Pennsylvania, a very rural area. That state system, the Pennsylvania State Higher Ed system, is one of the systems in the country that is having huge financial difficulties. The demographic downturn there is phenomenal. The drop in state appropriation has been significant. So I keep in touch with people there. Then I moved to the State University of New York. Oh, and while I was there, we started a regional student program. Because I was familiar with NEVI, most of the population near Mansfield was in the southern tier of New York. And we worked it through the Pennsylvania legislature and the Chancellor's office that only Mansfield University would be allowed to do a regional student price in the 10 counties that were right across the border from us. So this tuition issue has been part of my life for too long. Then I went to the State University of New York, and when I was interviewing for the job there, they had heard about what we had done, this incursion into the southern tier of New York, and they said, "Weren't you afraid of what we would do in return?" This is the State University of New York, which is known for its bureaucracy. And I said, "Oh, not in the least. Higher ed does not respond at all to these kinds of trends. I knew you wouldn't. You wouldn't be able to." In fact, the Pennsylvania system did all it could to prevent us from doing that. I was stunned that we got it through. So then I was in New York, and Empire State College served 18,000 students in 36 locations from eastern Long Island out to Buffalo, including Bed-Stuy, Labor Center in New York. Varied rates, but 1 out of every 3 credits of 18,000 students was done online, which got me into online pricing and into understanding what is the pricing on a national level up against the for-profit sector as well. I'm in my 8th year at Lesley University. For purposes here, let's just describe that as a classic, private, not highly selective institution, which is the way most private institutions are. The media would have you believe that all the private institutions are, Williams and Middlebury, etc. They are not. The vast majority are like Lesley. They are non-selective. They are tuition dependent. They have modest tuitions, modest institutional aid, and they are all engaged now in what I would call significant tuition discounting that escalated when the recession came, and those numbers have not gone down. If you want to talk about tuition discounting, that might be something we talk about. But it's in the background of what you did here of raising the tuition. I think it was 5%, with 2% going to scholarship aid and 3%, if you will, net. So this whole idea of net tuition revenue, from my point of view, is related to the board's responsibility, the board's fiduciary responsibility, which is really related to what Alyssa was talking about, which is what is the quality of the student experience. That's got to be the driving issue behind any board decision or anyone's decision on tuition. Tuition, from my point of view, is not an independent variable. Things, grand and bad, do not happen because the board sets the tuition at 0, 1, or 2, or 3%. In-state tuition, if you raise it 1%, it's less than $100. If you go to 3%, it's less than $300. It is the entire value proposition that students are interested in and parents are interested in. And by that, it's a very simple ratio. At the top is what are the perceived benefits. That's your numerator, and your denominator is what are the costs. And to do the cost and to know that, you need to know some other data about each of the schools. What is the trend on EFC? Financial aid people can show that. What do we have? We have a diminishing middle class. It's going to manifest itself on somehow, and it's manifesting itself right now in increasing numbers of students with 0 EFC, zero expected family contribution. That doesn't mean that those people want 0 increase in tuition. It means the value of the experience must be significant. There must be a payoff. So I also caution all the boards that I've worked with to beware of the hubris of tuition setting. If you have a particular narrative about how you see this country and its finances, don't play it out in the tuition setting. It's not the place for it. It's just that sometimes when boards don't get together too often, it's the one place where somebody can articulate that position. We do have a declining middle class. We have a very stratified higher ed system. We have demographic downturns, which Joe's absolutely right, more severe in the rural area. The problem in the urban area is that's where we're seeing population growth, but the population growth is working class, often first generation American, brown instead of white, and lower resourced rather than middle class. And so the stress points at the urban community colleges is the extreme of what you're seeing right now in the VSC and other areas, which is increasing demand, very low retention and graduation rates, very low academic skill set coming in. In the sector that I've been in, interestingly, for the last 8 years, the private sector, the tuitions are now too high, and the middle class, which supported most of these institutions like Lesley. So Lesley began in 1909 in Cambridge. It grew for over 100 years with the growth of the middle class. The middle class is disappearing before our eyes with income inequality, et cetera, statistically. I felt that the tuition there, which it should have been $32,000 this year, just tuition. So add on room and board, and we're in the mid-40s, getting close to 50. We did a projection of where that was headed over the next 10 years. Basically, what we said was, staying with the status quo is a huge risk. We need to change it. So what we did is we dropped our tuition, and we dropped our tuition discounting. So this year the tuition was $24,000. You're not in a position to do that. You cannot lower your tuition. And many other privates couldn't. And the only reason we could is because 96% of our students, undergraduates, were receiving tuition discounts. If 80% of our students were receiving tuition discounts, we wouldn't have been able to drop our tuition because we couldn't lose 20% full pays and all that represents. But because we had so many receiving the tuition discount, we could drop the tuition, drop the aid, have the net be the same for them, and then try and get it where we could be more competitive. And then one of my final comments. You can put yourselves quite often in one of two camps relative to tuition. Generally appears to in the private side, but may be becoming more interesting on the public now as well. I call it the Chev is Real group and the sticker shock group. When I got to Lesley, how did they set tuition? The board looked at its 12 competitors and said, we want to be in the middle, slightly above the middle. So they set tuition. And I thought, this is crazy. But that's what they've done for years. The Chevis Regal says people are going to associate the higher the price, the better quality of experience. The sticker shock group says when people see the price, they're not looking at it, they're moving on, and they're not hanging around long enough to find out how much aid you can get. 3 years ago, a very reputable consulting firm, the Arts and Science Group, with the College Board, did a survey of tens of thousands of traditional high school age students. And what did they find? 1 out of 2 students moved off the college website for private colleges such as Lesley as soon as they saw the price. They didn't hang around and find out how much aid they could get. That's tuition shock. When we're losing 1 out of 2 just by looking at the price and moving on. And what happens in the sector I'm in is when all the private college presidents get together, which I find really interesting, having been in the public sector most of my life, what they say is, we've got to educate the guidance counselors, we've got to educate the parents, we've got to educate the students, because this is irrational. They're not finding out, they're not hanging around long enough to find out what the net cost is. They're confusing price with net cost. And I sit there and I say, I'm 18 years old, I'm checking out the website of Lesley, I see the full cost is $45,000 to $50,000 per year. I don't know exactly what my parent or parents make, but I know we never go anywhere. I know I've been working. I know my siblings work. I got a sense of this. This is crazy. I'm going to another school. That is a highly rational act, a very rational act. So I think I just make that point. Retention. I just want to mention this. At Leslie, we can gain more revenue by improving our retention than I can by any tuition hike. And if you run the numbers for a VSC institution, if you figure a 3% increase, let's take 1,500 undergraduates, okay? That's a $450,000 increase in revenue. But if you have 200 more students graduating, and you monetize both the cost and the gain of 200 more students enrolled, and I'm not talking new students through the admissions process, I'm talking about retained in all three classes, sophomore, junior, senior year. So let's call it 60 to 65 a year. And you do 10,000 times that, that's $2 million before you get to room and board and other fees. It's 4 times a 3% tuition hike. From my point of view, public institutions and places like Leslie, we need to do both. We need to have stability on the tuition setting and look at the total budget for the institutions to make sure, as Alyssa says, the students are getting the experience we want. And we work on the most significant revenue increase, which is retention. And that's related to not just the stability of the price, but the stability of the investment. I differ from many of my colleagues up here in the following, and I'll just say it. The timing of the tuition increase and the 2-year tuition rate. Our tuition is set by our board. It either is December or February meeting. We have no problem letting everybody know the tuition increase is probably going to be somewhere around 2 or 3%, and check the website. That doesn't throw people off. I think it's been so tight in Vermont that everybody thinks that that matters a lot. From my point of view, it doesn't, but my colleagues here have been in Vermont more recently, and maybe that's changed, so I want to respect that. And the other thing is, I'm not a big fan of the multiple year tuition rate because it's too easy for people to make the comment, if we could do something reasonable now, maybe we could do 0 next year. Next year could be tougher. And if that hurts the value proposition, you could lose not only, you could lose more students through attrition. It'll cost you a lot more than anything it would through the recruitment of new students. So I think the idea of stability and the board coming back and visiting, and by the way, the range that you're in, it's not that wildly dramatic, so it's worth checking in to see what the finances are and use the discipline of looking at the finances, what are the trends of VSC, how's the budget going, et cetera, and make sure you're doing that every year. And use tuition as the way to drive that, but don't think that tuition is the end-all variable.
Well, that was pretty cool, don't you think? Let's thank the panel, everybody. Tremendous amount of food for thought there. You know, as I look around the room, there's no way I can introduce everybody. I am impressed that I've seen every dean of administration of the 5 colleges that are here, a lot of people from the chancellor's office, people that represent staff and faculty, all kinds of people. I did want to at least make mention of the fact that we do have in the room with us all 5 of the presidents of the state colleges, and that shows you, I think, their commitment to the overall system and to the importance of this topic. So we are glad that Barbara Murphy made it back, and thank you, Barbara, for hosting this event at the same time as you have all this semi-finalist process going on here, and everybody's done a great job, so thank you, Barbara. We have Joyce Judy from Community College right back here, who's been one of our premier leaders for a long time in Vermont, and David Walk, who's also been around a little while himself, and is spending pretty much the whole week up here, which shows a level of commitment that we really appreciate from Castleton State College. So thank you all for coming. Now, this is the portion of the program where we can have question and answers, different perspectives, dialogue back and forth. Could be questions from panelist to panelist, trustee to panelist. Maybe if there's a question or a perspective that a president would like to weigh in on as well, that's fine too. So I'm hoping that somebody might have a question for the panel. We'll start with Tim German.
So I have a question for Joe Bertolino, but I would like to have Joe more and maybe Maurice respond to it too. And first of all, this has been riveting. I really want to thank all of you. Joe, thank you for coming here. I think your perspective is knowing us and the private sector is fantastic. Joe, you said in your comments that you were a little nervous about saying that we should focus on all students, not just Vermonters. So I was sitting here wondering, why do you think that? Because I think I would speak for the board to say that we wouldn't mind having more out-of-state paying students if it was helpful. You know, it was not affecting the mission of the colleges. And I'm wondering, so why did you think that was kind of an interesting statement? And also, just wondering about how, without having this growth model, how do we not have the colleges compete? Because one of the things, going back to strategic planning, and this is something Maurice talked about, how do we not be going after the same students and becoming more interdependent as colleges, but not totally independent? And I like that idea, and I think that the board has talked about that somewhat too. And how do we move more in that direction so each campus is individualized and not competing with the other ones?
In terms of, thanks, Tim. In terms of my comments related to Vermont students in particular, in the few years that I have been here, my experience or my interpretation of the conversation around the table related to tuition has been this push and pull, or perceived push and pull, between responsibilities, particularly for board members, responsibility to the state and to the taxpayers of the state versus, and if that is in, I'll use the word conflict, though that's too strong of a word, with the responsibility toward the system and the colleges. And so I've witnessed that interaction or that interplay at some level, whether it's happening at a board meeting or outside of a board meeting, in terms of, so what are our responsibilities? If I am a board member, what is my responsibility to the taxpayers of the state of Vermont, the students of Vermont? We are a Vermont college first, therefore, should our focus then primarily be on Vermont students? Intellectually that makes sense, but for Linden State, for example, 50% of our students are coming from out of state. And so we certainly do want more out-of-staters, but I guess I'm just challenging us to challenge ourselves to think about, when we set tuition or when we have conversations about revenues and expenses, we need to be thinking of not just Vermont students, but all of our students. And I think this gets back to what others have alluded to here, or spoken to specifically. Ultimately, what is the experience that our students are having? The quality of the experience. So maybe I felt like I was putting myself out there, I don't know, but I just felt that it was important to say, based on my own experience. The second piece is you asked about, how then do we utilize the interconnectedness is what I had talked about. From my perspective, I think that we've reached a point where our students are saying, how do I complete my degree? Not just where do I complete my degree, but how do I complete that degree? And so I think it behooves us to have a conversation about a student being able to complete their degree, their Linden degree, in as many flexible ways as possible. And that may mean that they are taking a course at CCV, and some of this already happens, that they're taking a course at CCV, or that they're taking an online course at Castleton, or they're taking a particular course at Vermont Tech. I know that, for example, right now, I have a student who just got a job in atmospheric science. He hasn't graduated yet, okay? But he got a great opportunity to be a chief meteorologist in Texas. We're gonna say, pack your bags and go. Take this experience. And in return, we're gonna put a camera in the classroom, and we're gonna work this out with your professor so that you can take the 3 remaining courses you need to take so that you can graduate. I think the more creative we are in our delivery, the better we will be able to serve students, and the more students we will retain ultimately.
So, Joe, were you going to weigh in on that? I think it was
Well, just,
Did anybody? No, go ahead.
this is a chestnut, isn't it? You know, this whole thing of in-state, out-of-state, and historically, for people who've been in state for a long time, know that it really got started with the Laddie Core time at UVM, where the state appropriation was so low that to bring in more and more out-of-state students, and then the numbers hit once a year, you know, in the Burlington Free Press about how many out-of-state students were at UVM, and the president would be called down to the legislature and talk about it. The patterns within the VSC are the same as they were 20 years ago, just looking at them now. Linden's got a larger percentage of its undergraduate population from out of state because of the NEBI programs, right? Castleton has traditionally been larger, percentage-wise a little lower, but the number's about the same. CCV, virtually no weight. Anybody around the board coming into the Brattleboro office or something like that. Very minimal out-of-state here at Johnson. And VTC, fairly low. Some of it through the regional student program, I assume, still, yeah. So to me, I mean, if I were in a position of influence in Vermont, I'd be encouraging the 4 institutions to not be apologetic about it. It's the same theory of bringing in the out-of-state funds and the diversity of out-of-state students, strengthens it. It's a time of demographic downturn. We should be turning there. You also mentioned CCV. I have been befuddled by this for 30 years on the, and I don't know where it stands now, but CCV is a great catch basin of adult learners. And when I look at CCV and digital learning, if I were at one of the 3, 4 institutions, and perhaps some degree, I'd have to think about it at VTC, the notion of serving CCV alums, graduates, and using the digital age to bring people more and more together would help strengthen my institution in many ways, and I would be as aggressive as I could be on that. So, just a few thoughts there.
Quickly, I just wanted to mention, you know, I think that it's important for each of our campuses to be doing as much as we can to bring young people to the state of Vermont in general. I think that, you know, the issues for Vermont students and out-of-state students are very similar in the conversations around tuition. Our gross tuition prices for Vermonters on paper look like they're very affordable, but students, as I said earlier, still want a scholarship. They want something. They want to be recognized for something. And when it comes back to, you know, competition amongst ourselves, I can speak from firsthand experience that I always feel really good when someone comes up to me at a college fair and asks me about a program that Castleton doesn't offer, but that one of our VSC fellow institutions does, because we can refer those students to one another. So I think over time, if we're more strategic in thinking about our new programs and planning that way, I think that will help the cause significantly.
Jim Matheson.
Given that this is a meeting about tuition, I guess I'm pleased to say that none of you said right out from the start, please cut your tuition, because that's the way to solve your problem, because that's certainly not my perspective either. I'd like to comment on, this volume all right? On comments that Joe Moore made and Joe Berlino made in specific, although appreciate everything that all of you said. With regards to what you started with was retention. You said, Joe, student experience above all is one of the most important things, and and Joe Bertolino, you said broad liberal arts education coupled with experiential education, which I think is exactly right. All of us were young adults once, and the connection, the thing that we were trying to figure out when we were then young adults is how do we get from here to there? And I think that one of the things that the state colleges, new chancellor, all of us energetic, might work on is those connections of experiential education while we're at college and are trying to figure out what to do within our home state or you know, or where we came from or that kind of stuff. I think success in that regard will help us clearly justify the tuition that we charge students, knowing that what they get out of it is a profound experience and it's going to work for them. So more of a, my 10 cents, more of a question, but I was pleased to hear what you said. It seems to go in that direction.
Gary Diamond.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions. Nobody mentioned the concept of individualized tuitions as opposed to same percentage for everybody. I mean, it just didn't come up in the conversation. So I want to ask the question. We kind of broached that subject last year when we did a special percentage for scholarships for Castleton and for Linden, but the base was the same. But are there thoughts about why we set a standard tuition increase, let's say, for all of our institutions, but they're not based on the individual needs of the particular college? And should we be considering that? Just your thoughts for question one.
You know, I think I would, were I a board member, I would encourage the presidents to explore that. I mean, that particular question, and even less a function of percentage differential than the actual dollars amount, because percentages are sort of an abstraction. But when you begin to talk about what a 3% tuition increase actually looks like in terms of dollars or 4%. It's both more manageable in terms of student contemplation, but also it changes the conversation a little bit. But you know, our colleges are structured differently in terms of the education they offer. Some of us have more labs, and that historically has been a rationale for Vermont Tech to have somewhat higher tuition, and that our nursing tuition is even higher than our base rate. But it's appropriate to, at this point in time, given the financial scope of all of our institutional challenges, to ask the question, do we need to each go up the same amount? Or is there something about our particular strategic objectives with setting tuition that would suggest that we have a different, pursue a different strategy? I think that would be a reasonable line of inquiry at this point.
I would love to have the flexibility at Linden to provide not just flexible tuition at the different colleges, but specifically flexible tuition by program. For a place like Linden, we are primarily a professional development. We're primarily a professional school, and some of our programs are very high-end, very high-caliber programs, our atmospheric science program, for example. And so there are certain demands for certain programs, and clearly some of those programs, in terms of cost significantly more to run. So the more flexibility that we have to explore options. Now, whether those options add up, you know, financially or not, you know, I'll always turn to my CFO for that. She's shaking her head. But the truth of the matter is that I think the more flexibility we have to explore options, the better.
Jerry, I appreciate that question. I was alluding to that, and I probably didn't make myself too clear in my opening remarks, because I'm glad you brought that up. Last year, we did ask for additional money above and beyond the base, and we were able to put that additional money into a targeted grant program to help the neediest Vermonters on our campus. So I really like that idea and hope that going forward, the board would be open to those kinds of situations where baseline increase is met, and then there's an additional amount of money that could be considered to put back into programs for students that we know are effective in helping them stay there and graduate over time. So the numbers for Castleton, there were over 200 students last year who actually saw our tuition decrease because of that program, and they were our neediest students. And I look forward to reporting back to the board over time what the retention rates for those students are and ultimately graduation as we can study that group over time.
This came up in the SUNY system, which was really interesting to watch. What was fascinating, I thought, was that each of the presidents, this is of the bachelor's and master's degree institutions, so it left out Stony Brook, Buffalo, the big research universities, which have a little bit more flexibility on their own through the legislature. But during this discussion, I had a sense that every president was in favor of it when the chancellor brought it up. And then I realized, oh yeah, they all think that they're going to be the one that gets the higher rate. And then they forget the conversation they were just in with the key supporters on the Assembly and Senate Education Committees about how driving up tuition any higher was going to create a real enrollment threat. And therefore they're asking for more state appropriation support. And so that's why you've got to be really careful with this, because I think people see different outcomes in particular ideas that if you can play back the tape, you'll find it runs counter to price sensitivity. And so it becomes a pretty complex thing. It's one of those things, be careful what you ask for. Jim, could I respond?
Yeah, of course.
Thanks. If it wasn't clear from my original comment, I mean, I'm as concerned about the enrollment threat from the environment on our campus as I am about the enrollment threat based on our pricing. The feedback I get from admissions and folks is frankly that we're underpriced relative to the quality and the outcomes associated with a Vermont Tech education. And I'm worried that students are in an environment where the classroom living and learning environments are not what they would expect for what they're paying tuition-wise. So I'm more worried about that enrollment impact than I am about the impact of a 5% tuition increase. Relative to the conversation with the legislature, I mean, the board, I think, took a really aggressive step in this fall in identifying the projected 4.5% fixed cost increase into the next fiscal year and asking the legislature for $5 million to cover that. That appropriation would have changed the conversation about tuition in terms of covering our expenses into the next year and fostering that environment of investment. We haven't seen that in the budget, and we're not likely to see it from the legislature, so that creates a $5 million hole that will have an impact if we don't have tuition that then reflects it. Now, so to Joe's point about all the presidents thinking which side of the coin they'll be on the outcome, I mean, I guess the risk I'd like to entertain is that there's a right number and a right relationship between each of the 5 presidents in the colleges. And the outcome and the conclusion may be that student behavior and the market behavior suggests that we ought to keep things more coordinated. I would worry about, different than Joe, I would worry about independent program pricing because I don't want price within my institution to be an incentive for students to select a particular program over another, because then low enrollment may drive certain strategic decisions about program continuation. I want students to pick the program within our institution that makes the most sense for them.
So before we go to Bill Lippert, I just mentioned for the folks in the audience, the board did provide a little bit of a differentiation, as has just been stated last year, with a 3% base. Castleton used the additional flexibility for scholarship aid. I thought Linden went to 4, Johnson stayed at 3, so there was a little bit of flexibility there, and maybe that's something that we want to continue. Dan, he didn't mention it, but some of the materials we set out talked about the experiments that are going on, and I don't know if that's the right word for them, experiments in Pennsylvania, maybe other places where they're really starting to try to charge per credit hour. And then there was also the idea of maybe, charging for a flat tuition for 12 to 15 credits. And if you take more than the minimum, then you actually pay extra for those. So there are certainly other, kind of like variations in the theme we could think of, but the board did provide a little bit of flexibility this past year. Bill Lippert?
Well, interestingly enough, what Jerry raised was at the top of my list of things I wanted to raise. But if I put it in the context of, I've been sitting here thinking, what are administrative decisions or decisions to be made by administrators versus board decisions? And I found myself thinking in terms of that question itself as to whether I think there should be some clarity as to whether the board authorizes variable tuition increases or variable tuition rates, or whether that falls within the province of the authority of the Chancellor's office and the President's. And I think for me, there's a series of questions that fall, what is the board's role, and what are the college's administrative role in some of these issues? And there may be differences of opinion and debate on that, but I think I would operate from the position that I expect you all to make recommendations to the board. I expect you to have more information and knowledge about what you believe should be the appropriate tuition increase or the variable tuition between the colleges, etc. I'm not looking for the board to do that part of the job, and I think we need to get aligned and clear about what our expectations are as the board, and so that there's an alignment of expectations around these issues. And then, and I think that touches on, we have some semblance of interconnectedness, as Joe Bertolino was talking about, an increased interconnectedness between the colleges. And again, I think there's an issue of what is a board, what stances do we take, or what actions do we take as a board to facilitate that, to encourage that, to authorize that, and at what level is there an opportunity to just continue to build that within the framework that we already exist within. Separately, I wanted to ask Joe Moore, you described Leslie's decision to lower tuition, to lower tuition to $24,000, et cetera, and to modify how you were providing scholarships, et cetera. My question is, did it work? I didn't hear that part.
I was afraid somebody was going to ask that.
Or is it working?
We don't know yet. So if you think about any product and changing the price in a marketplace, we got a lot of people to get that information to and get it through. So we did it where it could have affected this past fall, the fall of 14. No influence as far as I can tell. And David and I had talked about this before. I didn't expect it to have any influence there. It's really a long-term thing. The applications, the undergraduate, we have 2 undergraduate schools, and the applications there are at all-time highs, which I'm not celebrating, but it beats the opposite. And the reason I'm concerned about it is that it's the same caution I began my comments with. Be careful about thinking that tuition setting is an independent variable. So most other private college presidents will not do this. I'm counting on that. They won't do it. They will just try to get to their retirement before the whole current model blows up. So I don't think that's going to happen. And the biggest reason they don't do it is because they don't want it to appear like it's a fire sale, and they worry the impact. So it's the perversion of the Chev's Regal argument. But our applications are up significantly, the highest we've ever had at both schools. But we also began a new marketing brand piece that kicked in over the last 18 months that I think is the strongest we've ever had. We've been working much, much more on the whole value proposition on retention. We have a pretty spectacular new arts center that's opening up this weekend that has been on my agenda over the last 8 years. And so students coming next year have been able to see that project in play and see it. So there's lots of other things. The other thing that's going on, which I think may be in the background of some of our colleagues' comments here, is there are more applications per student now than any time in history. And what that means is the degree of commitment behind each application, if we put it on a scale, is lower, which is driving yields to be less predictable. And it's that reason that Moody's, in their review for the coming year of projecting the strength of the portfolio of institutions that Moody rates, which are institutions that are financially stronger than Leslie and the VSC, they came out with another negative outlook for the 8th year in a row since the recession. And the person who headed that, I've gotten to know, met her at a conference, and I asked her what was driving that. And she said, we thought we were finally going to be able to do a stable outlook. But what we found is the demographic downturn, so figure a line graph over the last 10 years, the demographic downturn of high school students goes like this. And then they had an application bar, number of applications. And the bars have gotten larger and larger. So that's what's driving the pressure that people in enrollment management and financial aid offices are feeling, which is some numbers may be up, but we don't know what the yield's going to be. So the highly selective institutions can still count on their high yields, but those, the rest of us, the vast majority of institutions, there's much greater uncertainty. So I think for our tuition piece in our sector, check back in 3 or 4 years and see, and check in the spring and see what's our yield. That's going to be the real test. A faculty member asked me, Joe, are you going to be able to show a correlation between this tuition rate and, you know, if we do better, how are you going to be able to show that the drop in the tuition and the discounting caused that? I said, if that happens, I don't need to prove anything to anybody. There may be many reasons why, and this is one.
I was just going to make one quick comment as it comes back to the timing of the setting of tuition, and I know I appreciate your stance on that, Joe, but one of the things that I think has affected the Vermont State Colleges, looking around at other states in the past few years and seeing the high increases in tuition that have gone on there, it's kind of one extreme or another. We've seen, you know, tuition freezes or big jumps in states around us. So I think there's some fear among some of our students that 3 or 4%, 2 to 3%, I agree with you, that oftentimes we can just say, oh, it's going to go up by that much and it's not a big deal, but there's fear among some of our prospective students and families that there might be a jump like there have been in some other states, and that becomes a real fear. So I just wanted to...
We'll do Pam, then we'll do 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll take a break and get back to the next portion of the program.
I just wanted to add to that conversation that, you know, we talked about the decline in the number of high school graduates here in the Northeast. We're taking it pretty hard. Well, I'd be willing to bet that per capita we have more colleges here in the Northeast because that's where it started. So the competition is fierce. And, you know, institutions are getting very creative in their tuition discounting, some of it more fair than others. But for the campus-based schools, those students are looking at all those options now. So I absolutely agree that trying to predict the yield, you know, we're different, obviously. Our students are local, they come from their community. But we're seeing the decline in high school students impacting us. The job market got a little bit better, so people aren't taking the classes that they need. But I think when you look at the continuation rate of Vermonters, and I think this is part of the function of the board as well, is to really be out there encouraging those families who don't think that this is an option, for them to understand it is an option. And within Vermont, we have, you know, the Vermont State Colleges, we have 5 very good options for them, to be encouraging them to think about college, help them figure out how, we will help them figure out how to pay for it. But this relates back to the financial literacy issues we have in the state. my son hates me for this, but whenever I go through the grocery store and the high school senior I know is there, like, what are you gonna do? And she's like, oh, I don't know, work, I guess. I said, well, have you thought about college? Oh, I can't afford it. I said, well, have you looked at CCV? Well, what's that cost? I said, well, over the year, it'd be, about $5,500. To a 18-year-old whose parents didn't go to school, that's like, that's what, I can't even get into the conversation about ways to help them afford it. So we've got a lot of grassroots work to do, and I think the board, with all of your connections in your community and the various opportunities you have to speak up about higher education in Vermont, you could do a lot of that work to support our work.
So listen, what we're going to do, first of all, any other questions from trustees? Okay, so we are going to have a public input session, but I did see a couple of hands by people in the audience, one there and one in the back. And if you care to ask a question, we'll do that, answer it, and then we'll take our break. So young man?
I can wait till the public discussion if that's more appropriate.
Is it a question for one of the panelists, or?
No, it's a question I want to talk about next month's vote about the tuition increase.
Okay,
That's
well, why don't
fine.
we wait for the public input session, if that's all right. A question in the back?
Hi, I do have a question.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, your name to teach.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lorna Flom, and I'm part-time here at Johnson State College, and I've been engaged in the Vermont State Faculty Union. Actually, my question is, it's an observation and a question. First, I wanted to say Alyssa's comment and several other of the panel's comments about the need to really focus on the quality of student experience is really the be-all, end-all of why we're doing this. I'd also like to, but I wanted to say that I think the adversity that we're in and the end of the paradigm that we're in, that you've spoken about and that is deeply felt on all levels, is something to really think about in terms of how to move forward. And reinvention, which is like innovation, does require investment, but it doesn't necessarily require only capital investment or monetary investment. It requires commitment from all parties. And I'd like to really hear more going forward, not just today, but to see an extraordinary commitment on the terms, on behalf of the Board of Trustees and the presidents and administrations of the college to really try to tap into more sources of revenue other than students. I'm tremendously concerned about the fact, I know this is a panel just on tuition, but I'm tremendously concerned about the fact that really you've only spoken about tuition and really only seem to think about the dollars in, dollars out that the students, and I'm not saying that in a totally negative way. I understand that this is a conversation about tuition, but I am tremendously concerned by the real need of my students and the real desperation. And if people aren't willing to take the risk to get an education, they need to see quality. There needs to be much more transparency about the balance between administrative and instructional quality, costs, ratio, expenses. And I think to reinvent ourselves truly, we need a deeper level of communication. There needs to be deeper transparency between faculty. The faculty have brilliant ideas on how to change and work with institutional, needs. The faculty, and part-time and full-time, are a tremendous resource, and I do feel that there's a lack of transparency on a lot of the administrative decisions that are made on how to move forward. And I do think that there could be much bigger, deeper conversations, and that students really should see where their money is going and why so much of the school is running on their money, which is really tapping into their future possibility as people. And if we're talking about the degradation of the middle class, which is the reason that you're not getting enough students, we're contributing to that by tapping out their ability to go ahead and plan families and educate them and house them. And really the country is just chasing its tail and eating itself alive by laying on the backs of the students. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement, there's a lot of room for collaboration, there's a lot of room for commitment to a new future. And I agree also with Joe Bertolino on the fact that our particular group of 5 colleges could truly be more interconnected. And with a better vision, we could definitely have a greater transparency on administrative and instructional quality costs, because if we're more interconnected, we might be able to reduce some of our administrative overlaps and so forth. So really, it's a conversation that needs to be had on many levels. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you for your perspective, and thank you for your commitment. And I think those are important issues to address. We are all in it together. The reason we were really pretty much talking about tuition today is that the decision is coming up at the board meeting in a month, in less than a month, and we wanted to make sure.
I would really like to know.
That's fine.
More tools in the basket to reclaim the promise.
Sounds great. That's good. I just wanted to know why, instead of dealing with the whole deal, today was kind of like tuition, because we want to get our heads around it and make the most, the best decision we can on the best information we have. So thank you very much. So thanks again to the panel. It's, what is it, almost 10 past 2. We are definitely done here at 3:30 or earlier. So we're not going to be going any later than 3:30. And I think if we take a 10-minute break, we'll come back. Tom will do some high-level comparable and other data presentations on a PowerPoint that was sent out to the board members in advance. And then we'll have a little further discussion and then see about coming up with some potential motions that we might consider sometime down the road and be done before 3:30. Maybe not much before, but before 3:30. So take a break. Thank you.